John, what is the question that you are asked most often about breaking into television, and how has your answer evolved over the years?
Well, a lot of writers have an interest in television, but they see it as this, this castle that they have to get into that's very difficult to get through the wall. And so they want to know, how specifically do you do that? And what they think is the answer is that you come up with a spec idea for your own TV show. And unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. You can have a great idea for a TV show, but it won't matter unless you have a tremendous amount of experience writing for television, writing on a television staff. So the process that a writer needs to go through is to, first of all, write a spec script for a show that's already on the air. And what that means is you want to focus on a particular show that, first of all, that you like very much, that you really know top to bottom. It's a show that should be very popular, so that it's going to be running for a few years. And it should be a show that is highly regarded. In other words, it was constructed well. Its critics really like it. The reason for that is that when you write a spec script for a really good show, it improves your writing as well. It shows you off. And what you do then is you study that show very carefully. You come up with an idea for a script for that show. You write the script, and then it's important to realize that you're not writing it because you think you're going to sell that script. You're writing that script as a calling card, which will then be sent around to various TV shows, and this proves that you have the skills to write at the professional level for television. One other thing I would say about this is that the primary emphasis in television is being able to crack stories really fast. In other words, to come up with a new story for that show at a really high rate of speed, because TV has this time element that is much more intense than film. So you've got to be great at story. And this is the primary skill that writers need to emphasize.
So one should realize that they need to pay their dues. They're not going to be just plucked and unknown, and their idea is going to just change everything. They really have to start from the ground up.
Right. With film, it's a little different. Keep in mind, you can write a spec script for a film that is actually good enough to be bought and might even be made. This is not the case in television. In television, you've got to pay your dues, and the steps of paying the dues are much more, they take a much longer period of time, but the payoff is tremendous. And the steps that you're looking for then are, you write the spec script, it's a good calling card, somebody hires you to be a staff writer on the show, you then get experience writing for a television show, then they might give you the opportunity to create your own show. That's the ultimate payoff.
And why? Why are there two different ways of doing things? Is the television, it's because it's already established, there's a show, there's a whole system in place, whereas each film's its own separate unit?
Exactly. With the film, you can come up with a great script, with a great premise that is a highly commercial idea, and even though you won't have a tremendous, say, amount of experience as a professional screenwriter, because it's a one-off, because it's a single unit that is going to be made, you have a chance of it being bought and made. Whereas with television, when you're creating a TV show, basically you are creating a big business. This is a show that needs to run minimum 5 years. So with anywhere from 13 to 24 episodes per season. So you're talking about, in some cases, for example in Seinfeld, almost 200 shows that they're doing over the course of the history of that show. So you've got the amount of money that is going into creating and sustaining that show is just immense.
And going back to whether your answer has evolved over the years, was there a time when you thought that a virtual unknown could break into the business, and then you see that it just doesn't happen that way?
It's funny because people always want there to be an evolution in terms of how you break in, but it's remarkably the same over the years. This has been the way you break into television from the very beginning. Now, where it has changed is in the film area. Because in the film area, the typical way was you write a spec script, you try to sell that spec script in a nice big spec sale. Now, what's happening now though is that with the internet and the ability to make a short film and post it so that anybody can see it like that, it's a huge change. Because in the past, when you wrote this spec script, you had to get it into the studio. And unless you're a writer with an agent, which most writers do not have that agent, you can't even get into the studio to have it read. Once it's in the studio, then it has to get through a reader. And readers say no 99.9% of the time. If it gets through the reader, it then has to go to a story executive. And the story executive has to say, I really like this. So you got to get through all these obstacles. And keep in mind, the story executive doesn't have time to read your spec script, because the only time they have is on the weekends. And they don't want to spend their weekends reading your spec script. All of a sudden, you get this huge game changer with the internet, because you can post 5-10 minute short film, short video on the internet, and anybody, including that story executive, can take 5 minutes, 10 minutes to take a look at that video. And now that doesn't guarantee that all of a sudden, you're going to get a deal with the studio, but it gets you entrance, where before it was so much more difficult to get through that door, even to be noticed.
John, how does a writer distinguish between a movie idea versus a television idea?
That has changed over the years. It used to be a very clear distinction between film and television. Film was the big idea with the big spectacle, massive numbers of characters, big epic scale, so on. Television was the intimate story, very personal, just a very few characters, typically a drama. But because TV has evolved over the last 10 to 15 years in such a radical way, this distinction is now gone. And in fact, the biggest spectacle stories are now in television, not in film. You have a fantasy show like Game of Thrones, which is as big an epic and spectacle as you can get, far bigger even than, say, Lord of the Rings, in terms of the number of characters, the story weaves, all the different storylines that are going on, the literal scope of where this story takes place. I mean, it's a continent, essentially. So, and it's covering multiple seasons. This was the big game change, which is that in television up to about 10 to 15 years ago, when we had almost strictly what were known as standalone shows, detective stories or standalone shows, where we introduce a problem in the opening scene and we solve it by the final scene. And then next week we reset the whole thing and we do it again. That meant that the story scope was about 45 minutes long. Now, about 10 to 15 years ago, writers began to realize the incredible power of the TV medium for story, because they realized that instead of making this single episode the way that we demarcate the story, they realized it's the season that makes the difference. We're going to try to tell a story over an entire season. And so when we had the introduction of these serial shows as opposed to standalone shows, it meant that the scope of television increased radically, because a season is approximately 10 times longer than a single feature film. So that allowed us many more characters. It allowed us to have a much more complex plot. And this changed everything in terms of the type of story ideas that we would have in television versus film.
John, we had a question come in from Brad Hodges, and his Twitter handle is @IGotCarded. Hi, Brad. So he says, what strategies can we use to keep a hidden opponent concealed for a season without the reveal seeming like a cheat?
It's an interesting question, because this hidden opponent is a very important character in any form of storytelling. Now, with TV, we get an interesting problem, which is that when we have a hidden opponent in film, it's only going to cover about 2 hours. To sustain a hidden opponent in a television show, it would almost and sustain that over an entire season, the show would almost necessarily be a serial type of show. And what's happening, there's a great value to the hidden opponent, because we get a big reveal when we find out that this person that we thought was a friend of the hero is actually an enemy. But that's one pop. And so if you're trying to sustain that over an entire season, the cost is tremendous, because that means that the function of that character is reduced to that one moment, probably near the end of the season, when the big revelation occurs. Which is why I would suggest think very carefully about whether you want to sustain a hidden opponent for that long, because what you're giving up is tremendous. Now, in terms of how you do it, don't worry about whether the reveal will seem fake or artificial. The trick to when you reveal that character is the motivation. Why have they pretended to be a friend but are really an enemy? If you give them a strong motivation, the audience will accept it totally.
John, we have a question that's come in from Brad Hodges. His Twitter handle is @IGotCarded. And Brad asks, are there any major differences between the structure of a drama and the arranged structure of a reality show?
There are huge differences, and they're based almost totally on the type of genre that show might be working in. So, for example, in the drama area, we have all of the major genres that we have in film. For example, detective, crime, we have soap opera, we have fantasy, horror, science fiction, etc. Now, these genres determine the primary beats of how that particular show plays out. With a reality show, there are genres there as well. So, for example, we might have a game-based reality show like The Bachelor or Survivor versus a show like any of the housewife shows that are based on setting up a pseudo-family and then watching them fight as much as possible. So it, again, depends on how that show is constructed as to what the drama beats are and how they play out. The one thing that relates them all together, though, is that they're all based on hitting the 7 major story structure steps. Because any television show, like any movie, any novel, short story, play, the story, what makes the story work is, does that story hit those 7 major structure steps? Because that's the DNA of your story. And so that is the most important element in terms of whether that is a good story or not.
Are there different sets of rules for breaking into reality television versus, or is it all still the same?
The one big difference in terms of breaking into reality is that if you are a person who the audience wants to see filmed, like the Kardashians, then yes, you can jump right into it. Otherwise, no. And keep in mind, reality shows are created. They are written. We call them reality shows, but they're anything but reality shows. So, but they're the people who are shaping the story throughout the season are the producers. And so they create a framework for these, quote, real people to operate within. But because that framework is determined by them, and because they are constantly coming up with story ideas to generate conflict within that framework, they are in effect working as writers, although they are not paid that way.
So the process then for being a writer on a reality show would just be the same as what you'd mentioned previously then?
It's the same in the sense that you have to pay your dues, and you have to start by getting on a show and working on a show. And then once you're inside the walls and you're paying your dues, then you're given more and more power. You move up what is a very stratified system in terms of what you're allowed to do. And the higher you move up as a producer, the more creative power you have.
John, we had this question come in from Christopher Langan, and his Twitter handle is @Chris_Langan. And he writes, "Hi, I would love to hear something about a cliffhanger. What should be considered and written in the script?"
Cliffhanger is a very important technique in television. And a cliffhanger is simply a moment in the story when the hero is in maximum danger, but instead of playing out that event to its conclusion, we stop it right before it gets resolved, typically with the hero at their weakest point. They are hanging from a cliff, right? And so why would we have a cliffhanger? What's the value of stopping that scene right there and going to a different storyline? The idea is we're trying to hold the audience so that we can get them to come back. This is why we often get cliffhangers in television right before a commercial, because we want to try to hold on to them so they don't go to another show using the remote control. Now, the way it's written into the script, you don't, of course, say, well, this is a cliffhanger. You need to write anything differently to say that it's a cliffhanger. It is a cliffhanger by virtue of what happens in the action. So the real trick here is not how do you write it in the script. The real trick is how do you set it up in the story. And to do that, what you have to do is have at least one other major action line that you can cut to. You cannot have a cliffhanger if you have a single storyline. So where you'd get it is in a show with multiple storylines that are unfolding simultaneously. And then at the crucial moment, you stop one storyline, jump over to the next storyline. Then you take that to a cliffhanger, jump back to the first line, resolve the cliffhanger there, and take them to the next step.
Thinking back to someone like a Stephen J. Cannell, who was known for, detective shows and things like that back in the...
Rockford.
Right, 80s and 90s. And,
sure.
Do you see anyone similar nowadays that's duplicated that same type of success? He was just such a name, and he still is. I think he writes books now as well. But that same type of branding, that one person in television these days?
Well, he was a very important figure in the history of television. And he worked at a time when an independent producer like him could create essentially an empire within the television world. Now, in the early 90s, the restriction against the networks from owning their own shows was removed, and that ended the days of the great independent producer. Now, yes, we still have a few of these people around, the Law and Order, that sort of thing, the CSI franchise, and so on. But because now networks can own their own shows, they don't have to go to an independent producer who had all this power because he knew the network couldn't own the show. So their position has radically reduced. And I think there's been some advantages to that, but some real disadvantages to it.
What elements did you see in his stories?
He was a great popular storyteller, one of the best in the history of television. And he had a simple rule that he would always follow, which is that you send the hero up a tree, you throw rocks at him, and then you try to get him down. That was his structure, and it's a remarkably simple but very effective structure for telling a story, especially within the television world, and especially in, again, the standalone story, because this is that kind of simplicity of storytelling works perfectly in the crime and detective form. And that was, of course, what he was the master of, especially in shows like Rockford, which were comedy detective stories. This combination is very popular with audiences, especially with older audiences. And really, CBS built its entire network based on this type of show. So the form of the comedy detective, or simply the detective story, which works very well over 44 minutes, because you can quickly set up the problem, typically some kind of a crime. You go through a number of possible suspects, and because he was very good at trickery, at hiding who the real killer is, you then get these nice reveals at the end of the story. Boom, it's over, the hero has accomplished his job, and I'm happy. And that was the power of the standalone show. So his type of storytelling was perfect for the standalone form. Now, where we have this much more of an emphasis on the serial form, many more characters, many more storylines that we are interweaving, this very simple kind of structure where we send the character up a tree, throw rocks, bring him down, is not nearly sufficient. We need a much more advanced understanding of how to tell a story that will extend over an entire season. And this, by the way, is what now the networks and the cable companies are looking for, which is they want to see that somebody has the ability to interweave a vast number of stories, keep them all going, a number of balls in the air, as they say, and to be able to extend it over an entire season. This is extremely difficult to do, and that's why, in my opinion, the very best writers working in the American entertainment industry are working on serial TV shows.
John, do you think the quality of shows on cable is higher than those that are on network TV, and why?
They are higher quality on cable than on network, and it has to do with a major structural problem that the networks deal with, which is that, first of all, they have to do anywhere up to 24 episodes per season. A cable show like an HBO show, a Game of Thrones, for example, 10 episodes per season. The Sopranos, 13 episodes per season. The requirement of doing 24 shows versus 12 shows is immense, because what writers don't realize is that a single episode of television, whether for network or for cable, is approximately half the length of a feature film. And yet on television you have to then write half of a feature film, sometimes as quickly as once a week. Now that is tremendously difficult. In a screenplay for a feature film, if you wrote it in 3 months, that would be outrageously fast. So the requirement to do this at a high speed and maintain the quality is just immense. And there is simply no way that a staff, even a large staff, of a network show can produce that kind of quality at the same rate that a show on HBO can. And that's the biggest problem. You also get the problem that network shows tend to meddle much more in the creative process, the writing process, than on the cable shows. Now, we do have to make a distinction between paid cable, like an HBO, and cable that has commercials, right, like an AMC. Now, AMC also has tremendously high level of quality. You get shows like Mad Men, Breaking Bad, Walking Dead, three of the best shows on television. But again, the number of episodes per season, much less. You look at a show on network, like The Good Wife. The Good Wife is the best written drama show on network television. And the fact that they can do that kind of quality with the number of episodes that they have to do compared to, say, an HBO show, to me is the real story there. I mean, that show is phenomenal given the requirements that they are, and the obstacles that they have to overcome to write at that level.
Do you think also the fact that on networks certain subjects are off limit, or you can only explore them to a certain length, whereas with cable it can be more of an R-rated type of show and therefore have more of a following? Do you think that factors in at all, or no?
I think that there has for many years been that perception that on an HBO type of show you can have more nudity, you can have, in terms of the level of violence, for example, or drug use, use of language, and so on and so forth. But I think that's really a false indicator, because it might have been true when really HBO was first coming on and we had this strong contrast and people had never seen this before on their home television. But it's now been that way for such a long time that that kind of difference isn't really that big of a deal anymore, and network has pushed it much further than they ever did in terms of subject matter, nudity, and so on and so forth. So to me, that's really a false indicator, and those elements really have nothing to do with the quality of the story. What you see on these cable shows is the story quality. The level of story is so high. The quality of the writers working on these staffs is so good that that's what's bringing them back, especially when you keep in mind that almost all of these shows that are so highly rated are all serials. So it means that these are writers who are, again, tracking over an entire season, which is 10 times more difficult than creating a great story in a single 45-minute episode.
John, we had a question come in from MrMo.net, and Mr. Mo asks about writing genres in television. What does someone need to know? And about mixing them as well.
You couldn't ask a bigger question than that. It's a great question, but it's a very big question. Knowing your genre is extremely important in television, just as it is in film, because the genre that you're working in gives you the primary beats, the unique story beats that must be in your script if you're going to be doing that show properly. Now, as I mentioned before, television now covers all of the major genres, from detective and crime all the way through the fantasy, science fiction, horror, soap opera, legal drama, doctor drama, and so on. And these all work in radically different ways. Each of those genres has its own set story beats. And this is why in all the classes that I teach, including the television class, I spend a great deal of time going through all the beats of each one of those genres. In the case of television, though, it's also, I wish it was simpler, but it's not. But in television, it's not just knowing the beats of that particular genre that you're working in. It's also understanding how those beats are changed by the fact that it's on television, not in film. Because keep in mind, again, the difference. The primary difference is in film, we've got a 2-hour unit. That's all we have to do. With TV, the key feature is what I call extendability. We need to be able to take a story form and extend it not only over one season, potentially 24 episodes of one season, but over 5 seasons. So it's got to be, and that changes the genre itself, because then what you can do in that genre is very different when you're having to do it in 2 hours versus over 5 years.
John, we had a question come in from MrMo.net, and he asks, what should a writer know about story in the age of binge viewing, such as some of the Netflix series that are out right now, and House of Cards, things like that?
The advent of serials has totally changed not just how story works in television, but how viewers react to that, how viewers experience television. Now, binge viewing, of course, doesn't exist when we're talking about, say, a detective show, a standalone show. You wouldn't sit there and watch 10 episodes of Castle because every one of those is essentially the same story. Binge viewing happens when you have a serial, whether it's in drama or in comedy. And these Netflix, these sorts of shows are a good example of that. I remember last summer, AMC put on Breaking Bad from the very beginning to their most recent episode. Now, when Breaking Bad first came out, I wasn't interested in watching it. I thought, oh, this is another show about a guy who sells drugs. You know, who needs to see this? It's going to be the same old thing. Well, when they put it on one a day, which essentially allowed me to binge view for a month and a half on Breaking Bad, the experience of that show was totally different. Because what I was able to see is not only why this is one of the greatest TV shows that has ever been done, but I got to see why it's one of the greatest shows ever done. And it had to do with the ability of that writing staff to not only write great individual episodes, but to sequence the episodes over the course of the season and ultimately over the course of the entire show. And it was almost like wine tasting, and I think that's what binge viewing is like. Because when you're wine tasting, you immediately get to compare these different wines, and it becomes very clear why this wine is better than that wine. When you do binge viewing, you get to the links between the episodes become much clearer, and you see the true artistry of these storytellers in their ability to build a series of episodes to the climactic final episode of that season, and then to withhold certain things that have to be withheld to set up the opening episode of the next season. And so this whole use of the serial writing is causing people to have an entirely different experience of how they watch television and how they appreciate television, because I think this is also one of the places where people are realizing that the best story work in American entertainment business is in television right now. And by the way, I do classes all over the world. The single biggest interest wherever I go is to talk about and understand American television, because they understand that the quality of American television is the highest it has ever been, it is the best in the world, and they want to know how can they do it too.
John, what's your take on Netflix releasing House of Cards all in one day, and how they plan to do the same with Arrested Development?
I think there's a benefit to it, which is it allows some of the viewers that binge viewing experience, and to see how the sequencing of the episodes is going to work. And by the way, keep in mind, the audience for serials is different than the audience for the standalone show. A big part of the pleasure for the serial audience is to see this complex weave and the connection between all the episodes as they build. Now, that's very different from a standalone audience. The standalone audience loves to have that single increment of story, set up and solved, right? And that means they don't have to watch every week. Maybe I missed a couple of weeks. I don't have to worry that when I come back to the show, all these things have happened that I'm going to be hopelessly behind, right? So the serial story form is geared for religious viewing and religious viewers, people who, they just love Lost and they're fanatic about Lost. But those people who didn't get in on Lost right at the beginning, they throw up their hands and say, how can I possibly figure this thing out? I'm lost on Lost. So, they don't even try. But so the benefit of releasing these shows all at once is that you get that religious viewer. But there's a real cost to it, which is it becomes less of an event every week. As we're shooting this right now, the new season of Mad Men has just begun. And for religious viewers of Mad Men, that moment, Sunday night, when the new Mad Men episode happens, is a galvanizing moment. It creates a community of people who appreciate that show, and the anticipation of it is tremendous. If they had released all the Mad Men episodes for this coming season, you wouldn't get that, and I think that's a big loss.
Do you think there's any correlation between binge viewers being younger versus standalone viewers being older, because we're more used to watching Love Boat, great, turn it on Saturdays, and then bam, wait till next week?
Well, there's absolutely a huge difference in age. The demographic for standalone shows, which tend to be things like detective stories, sometimes legal dramas, hospital drama, and so on, are much older. The demographic for detective shows, the oldest demographic there is. Whereas for these kind of serial shows, it's always a much younger audience, and older audiences have proven time and again they're not interested in doing binge viewing.
John, are sitcoms dead? Are those a thing of the past?
The traditional sitcom has changed radically over the last few years. A few years ago, it was thought that the sitcom form had basically died and reality programming had taken over. Then they found it hadn't died, it just took on a little bit different form. Now, to understand sitcom is probably the most underestimated of all story forms. It's actually quite complicated. You have to tell a complete story, and it has to be funny in approximately 22 minutes. The requirement of the writer to understand their form, their structure, is incredible there. And it is one of the most dense of all story forms. We don't think of it that way because we're laughing, right? This is a comedy, and it's often, they're very stupid kind of characters. So we think, well, we don't have great respect for this form. At least a lot of people don't. But in fact, it is a very challenging form. Now, the sitcom form, just like TV drama, has a number of genres that make it up. Now, the traditional sitcom is the family sitcom. And that goes all the way back to the 50s with, Father Knows Best and Donna Reed and so on. And you had that classic nuclear family. And what the sitcom then showed us was family comedy and it was something that everybody in the audience could relate to, and a lot of times they would watch it as a family. Now, over the years, we've then broken into different kinds of sitcoms, and again, like TV drama, each of them steps out in a very different way. There are different story beats for each of these different kinds of sitcoms. So now, besides the family sitcom, we have the single sitcom, we have the anti-sitcom, we have the serious sitcom. A show like Girls would be an example of that. So what's happening then is the form is diversified, and that puts a greater challenge on the writer, because you have to be clear what kind of sitcom are you writing, how does it step out, and does this particular show change the sitcom? For example, Girls takes the basic sitcom form and turns it on its head. Every single beat of the sitcom is done in essentially the opposite way that it is normally done. And so this gives us tremendous benefits, because this is a, quote, sitcom that nobody's ever seen before. So right away it's got a freshness to it. But the way the traditional sitcom worked was done for a reason. It allowed us to watch this family for 5+ seasons. And again, we're talking 24 episodes on network, 24 per year. Again, a tremendous amount of output. So why do we have those beats in the traditional sitcom? Because that's how you create comedy plot over 5+ years. Now, so when you flip those beats, as they do on a show like Girls, it gives you some benefits, but you have tremendous costs, which means it makes it much more difficult to create plot over an entire season and over multiple seasons. This is the single biggest problem I see that Girls has, is it has a great deal of difficulty creating standard comedy plot.
Your thoughts on Seinfeld?
Seinfeld was the greatest sitcom ever, completely changed how sitcoms work. I believe that anybody who wants to write the sitcom form should study that show, from literally see every episode, break it down, understand it, because at every level of comedy writing, from story to comedy lines to words, brilliant, genius. The way they handle characters was revolutionary. Seinfeld was the first show to break the conventional wisdom that said we have to have, quote, likable characters, right? And then this, again, came from the family sitcom, where everybody was in this nice family with the good dad and the good mom and the kids who they'd do some things wrong, but nothing too serious, right? Everybody was so likable. Well, all of a sudden you had 4 people on Seinfeld who were selfish. They did often really horrible things to each other and to other characters on the show. And they were, by all standards, unlikable people. And yet, we loved that show. We would follow that show, and we liked those characters because of their flaws, not in spite of it. And so this changed everything in television and the way that, especially television comedy, handled characters. What's often not really appreciated in Seinfeld is it was revolutionary in the way it handled plot. With the Seinfeld plot, you had typically 4 storylines that had to be accomplished in 22 minutes. We still had the same 22 minutes. So instead of tracking a single storyline, what we usually refer to as the A line, we had 4 lines that were generated by each of the 4 primary characters on that show. Now, the advantage to that is you get a much more complicated story weave than you got on the traditional family sitcom. And that meant the plot was much more complicated. But where they took it to another level was they didn't just intercut 4 different storylines. Well, what is Elaine doing at this moment, and what is George doing at this moment, and so on. No, the brilliant part was how they interwove them so that they all came together, all 4, at one point at the end of the story. So I always referred to the Seinfeld plot as a Zen show, because what they would do is always about some kind of injustice that they were dealing with, some perceived injustice that they were dealing with, and they would always come up with some scheme that they would try to defeat this injustice, right? But being this Zen show, the karma show, what would happen is through this incredibly intricate, interwoven 4-line plot, we would get their comeuppance. We would get the real justice that would come at the end in always a very surprising way. And the primary creative force behind this was Larry David. And he's really a giant in the history of the sitcom form. And you can see essentially that same approach to story, that same approach to plot in Curb Your Enthusiasm. Also taking, by the way, the concept of the unlikable character 10 times further, because with the character on Curb Your Enthusiasm, he is purposely shoving your face in it, as I dare you to still watch when I do this, when I go even farther. I mean, he is George magnified by 10 times.
Why do you feel that it's okay now to have unlikable characters versus Leave It to Beaver or I Love Lucy? Is it just a sign of the times have changed where that whole nuclear family is really no longer in many sense? Or what is it that we're more willing to look at these unlikable characters and even root for them?
Well, the first reason is what you just mentioned, which is the classic nuclear family no longer exists, or it's greatly diminished from what it was. And this, of course, is the whole foundation for Modern Family, which is revolutionary in the sense that it's taking the family sitcom and it's modernizing it by creating a family which is made up of 3 variations to the nuclear family. Each is a different version of it. We have the older guy marrying the younger woman with the kid. Right? We have the 2 gay guys with their family and the little kid, and then we have what looks like a nuclear family, but it's not with the classic father knows best, father-dominated nuclear family. It's a mother-dominated, it's a female-dominated family. So, and then what they do is they take these 3 versions of family and put them together as one family. And all of the episodes are tracking these 3 different families, ultimately coming together as one family at the end. So that's one reason why the audience can appreciate these unlikable characters, because what they see as reality is these all different versions of who people can be and how they can relate to each other in a family. But the other reason is that the audience's understanding of story has changed and grown, because they realize unlikable characters are much more interesting. And it is because of their character flaws that we like them more, not in spite of those flaws. And this indicates an understanding by the audience of media, of story. Their story knowledge is so much higher now than it was back in the 50s and 60s when the traditional sitcom stories and families were shown. So it really represents, now in order to catch the audience, you have to do much more with your character work, your initial character creation, than you had to do in the past.
Would a Seinfeld or a Mary Tyler Moore have worked today?
I think they would work. Certainly a Mary Tyler Moore
would have to be changed in the sense that its fundamental feature, the fact that she was, you're going to make it after all, one of the original women's liberation shows done in a comic version, that kind of pioneering woman is not a pioneer anymore. We've now had that for many years. But still, the key to that show was the brilliance of the writing, how the characters were created, the character oppositions. This is all the stuff, the nuts and bolts of how a show is created that I talk about in my TV class, which is it's all about, it's not just about creating individual characters, it's how you relate them, how you create a web of characters, because again, this is how we're going to generate a show for 5 years. It's the interaction between these characters. Doesn't come from outside characters that we bring in every week new. It's how the characters we know and love, how they play off each other, and we have to create a comic opposition that can be sustained for 5 years. That's really hard to do. But on that show, it was brilliant. The comic characters and the character web, they're brilliant. Similarly, a Seinfeld, the character oppositions, if you look at how it was created with those 4 central characters, and this is a crucial concept in both sitcom and TV drama, the foundation of 4. And this is one of the techniques for, again, generating story over multiple years. But again, Seinfeld brilliantly created in both the character and the plot. And I believe that that's what audiences most relate to. Now, even at the time, Seinfeld almost didn't make it because it was so revolutionary and it was so different compared to what anybody had seen before. And it was also, instead of talking down to the audience, it was very advanced in terms of how quick it was, the wit, the wordplay, and so on. And that also went against conventional wisdom. So, but the fact that the simple quality of the comedy writing was so great, I believe that it would be still successful today, although it might have to be on cable, like a Curb Your Enthusiasm, because that is essentially Seinfeld. It's all of the key characteristics of Seinfeld, but in a slightly different form. But of course, it's on cable. The increase in choices that we got with cable television was huge in terms of its effect on storytelling and its effect on the quality of storytelling that happened in the TV medium versus film. With all of this choice, this explosion of choice, there was a huge downside, which was that it fragmented the audience. And that meant that the normal economic model of how TV worked and how it would be consumed no longer worked that way. And so for example, the number of people in the audience for any show on network started to fall, and fall radically. Now, the upside of it was that with all this extra choice, the need to write a show that appealed to the lowest common denominator, i.e. the biggest number of possible people that we can get to watch our show, that changed. And now we could create a show that would appeal to a smaller segment, still influential segment of the audience, but a much smaller segment. And so you get a show like Mad Men on AMC, which has maybe 3 million viewers per episode. That's peanuts in network. And yet this show has tremendous influence. And the people who watch Mad Men, who love Mad Men, are people that the sponsors want to get to. But what that also meant then was that if we don't have to try to appeal to everybody with, again, the idea that it's the lowest common denominator, we don't want to speak above people
And so there was a tendency to dumb down the story. The reverse occurred, which was, for this audience, let's make the most challenging story possible. It also meant, because the way cable worked, especially pay cable, it was all about, let's come up with a show that will appeal to our subscribers, not to the largest audience. And so the freedom to do something really unique and different was there for the creators. And that's also where we started to get the serials coming in and so on. So all of these things work together to come up with a number of shows now that are as good as we've ever had in television. We are now in the golden age of television. And a good reason for that is because of the presence of cable and how that allowed us to do a lot more genres and tell stories to a much more focused audience. So we've got a cable channel like AMC that can generate 3 of the best shows that have ever been on television in Breaking Bad, Mad Men, and Walking Dead, each in their own unique genre. Not possible on network.
Why was there a tendency to dumb down the content and how the actors sort of relayed their message to the audience? Why is it now acceptable to either be at their level or above?
I think it was, again, one of those pieces of conventional wisdom which are oftentimes wrong. Just as the idea that you have to have likable characters, which was proven wrong, the idea that you have to write down to the audience was proven wrong. And again, Seinfeld was a big step in that direction. The perception was that in order to get the biggest possible audience, and remember, when in the old days, we're talking 30 million people to watch every week that show. That's a lot of people. And so the idea was, we can't do these huge differences in terms of either intelligence or in terms of where we take the characters, the highs and lows and so on, the complexity of how we have these characters interact. We can't do any of that stuff if we're trying to get 30 million people a week. That at least was the perception of it. And there may be some truth to it, because there is no cable show that gets 30 million people a week, not even close. But the point is that when you no longer had that requirement from above, which was you've got to appeal to this many people, then it was, how do we tell the best story we can tell? Now, another key feature is that over the years, writers have taken total control of the medium. And in my view, this is the single most important reason why the writing in television is better than any other medium in American entertainment. Writers control the medium, not directors, not producers, not movie stars. And the result is plain for everybody to see. It used to be that film was thought as the little brother, oh well, if you can't make it in film, well, you can maybe try television. Well, that's completely flipped now. And again, it's because of this fractured audience. Film still, they're trying to appeal to a worldwide audience. That's even bigger than 30 million people. They're trying to get people all over the world, which is why the differences of what we see in film are now the narrowest it's ever been. We basically have, out of Hollywood, superhero movies. That's it. Yeah, at Oscar time, you'll get maybe the 5 films that Hollywood made that year that are dramas, that are serious works of art, that we then get to nominate for Best Picture. And then everybody forgets that for the whole, other 11 and a half months of the year, they're putting out superhero movies, comic book hero movies. That's because that story form, that genre, which is essentially myth plus action, appeals to the largest number of people in various cultures around the world.
TV doesn't have that requirement, so it can do things as different as Breaking Bad, Game of Thrones, Downton Abbey, The Good Wife, and so on. And the quality within those genres on TV is so high. If you look at, say, the 9 major TV genres, you could argue that on 7 of those 9, we have the best show of that genre right now on that we've ever had. That's phenomenal.
John, we've had a question come in from Karen Reeder, and her Twitter handle is @moviehood. And she writes, what does it take to submit a spec script for TV?
Well, first of all, you've got to have a really good spec script. And what a lot of writers think is that the big obstacle is sending the script in, and that certainly is an obstacle because you do need an agent to get it through the door, to have somebody look at it. But by far the bigger obstacle that writers face is writing a spec script that's good enough to be sent in the first place. And this is where learning the craft is so important, and where writing a spec script of a particular show and executing it really well is so important. Keep in mind that when you send a spec script in, it will be read by someone of where whatever shows they send the spec script to. It will be read by somebody on that show. And what they're looking for is, did you execute the way this show is done? Because each show has a very specific set of rules. So we do these things and we don't do those things. And if you don't know that, and you make the mistake, for example, some shows do not have cliffhangers. They won't do that. And if you write cliffhangers in your episode, it's out. They want to see, can you write this show? Because remember, that's very challenging for a writer. This is not something that you are creating from scratch as you would with a spec movie script. This is, you are writing a story for a show that's already been created, for characters that have already been created. Can you get your voice into that show? That's what they're looking for. And can you tell a great story? One of the things I always talk about in the TV sitcom class is that the perception of writers trying to break in is that a sitcom is stringing as many jokes as you can get in 22 minutes. It's all about the jokes. Can you make people laugh when they read the script? Certainly the jokes are important, but any producer on any sitcom on the air will tell you that what they look for in a spec script is the story. They can add the jokes later. They're not worried about that. What's hard to come up with is a sitcom story that will be appealing to the audience, that can be the structure, the framework to hang the jokes on. And that's a talent most writers don't have. So again, I'm just trying to get the focus onto the real problem that has to be solved if you're a writer trying to break in, which is write a great spec script, because this is the calling card that makes all the difference. That is what makes or breaks your career if you want to work in television.
And know the show that you're submitting the script to. Don't do, a certain genre one for a sitcom that
Exactly.
know the culture of
You have to know that show top to bottom, and that's why, as I was saying earlier, one of the ways you determine which show to write for is it's not just a show that's highly respected by the critics, that's popular with the audience. It's a show that you love, that you watch religiously, so that you really know how that thing works. That's what they're looking for under the surface.
John, Rebecca Kerr from Australia writes in, and by the way, her Twitter handle is @RebeccaAKerr. She was hoping we could cover how fans and viewers can impact a story, and upon further research we found that consulting producer Ben Edlin of Supernatural has a quote where he says, "Just as fans respond to the material, he hopes that the material also responds to the fans. Like any dialogue, we're in that conversation. It gives us an indication of where the viewer expectation is, and that helps us play tension against the viewer expectation. We want to scare people and surprise them and make them worried. So it tells us where the zeitgeist is moving, so we can do a counter move or move along with it. So to further Rebecca's question, what do you think of fans influencing what is seen on television?
This is a major change in the way television works from the way it has worked in the past, certainly more than 2 decades ago. This is the popular medium. We're dealing with millions of viewers every week. And so with the presence now of the internet, the ability of shows to hear from their viewers, especially their religious viewers, and those are the people they're trying to get to, is much greater than it ever was before. And they really like to get that feedback. I remember many years ago when I worked on the staff of 21 Jump Street, a Stephen Cannell show, we would get occasionally a letter, right, snail mail, sent to us. This is many years ago. We get and we would devour this information. But somebody who cared enough about the show to write to us and tell us what they liked and what they didn't like. And so the show creator and the show staff are very interested in getting that kind of feedback. Now, it also comes from the fact that the audience's story knowledge, story ability is much greater than it ever was before. And keep in mind the great challenge for the staff writers, which is how do they stay ahead of their audience? Right? Because the audience has seen all this before thousands of times. They've seen that genre before thousands of times. So, especially if they're a religious viewer, they are going to spot story moves episodes ahead. And as the staff writer, that is what you are trying to avoid at all costs. So that is the most valuable information you're getting when you get feedback from your audience. Because they're going to tell you things they like about these characters, things they didn't like, moves that you used that they didn't like, and so on, moves that were unbelievable, and so on. It's very valuable. But the most valuable thing about it is it gives the writers ammunition for how to fool the audience. Because those writers will never give the audience what they ask for. I would like you to have the character X do this. That's exactly then what they will not do. Because, again, their key requirement is stay ahead of the audience. And that is very difficult to do.
So someone like the creator of Sons of Anarchy, I've seen him on Twitter, he'll tweet back and forth with fans, things like that. So it's good to have a dialogue going, but you're saying don't give them what they want, trick them in a sense, to always keep them on their toes.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's what they really love. But you have to do it within the parameters of the show, within who those particular characters are. And this is the great challenge for the staff, because especially as you move past the first season, you get into this problem of extendability. How can we keep telling this story? Walking Dead is a perfect example of this. This is a show about killing zombies. Okay, so the effect of that and the shock of that is over in the first season. So how do we take this story to a new level so that it isn't just a series of beats of zombies attack, we stab them through the eye, and then there's another zombie and we knock their head off, and so on and so forth. That's not story. So this is what the great challenge for the writers are, and why the audience can be so helpful, because that is the most advanced people in the audience are the people who will actually take the bother to write to the people on the show.
Going back to your time on 21 Jump Street, so when you would receive a letter like that, how would it be presented? Was there a staff meeting, you'd all get around, read I think that, you know, Johnny Depp should do this in this scene, or Richard Grieco, whoever. How would you present that to the group? Would you consider it?
Well, in my memory, way it worked was typically the showrunner would get the letter, would read it, and say, hey, we got this letter, you might want to take a look at it. And everybody wanted to take a look at it because these are always fans. I mean, it's not somebody writing in and saying, that was the worst episode you ever did. I mean, it's possible, yes, that they would write that. But usually it's, we love your show, you know, we love what you're doing, I especially love this, and when this happened, and blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, that kind of praise, that kind of feedback, just everybody ate that up, because you're writing on these shows, you're writing in a vacuum. I used to talk about going into the story mines every day, because you would work 12 plus hours a day. The hours are atrocious on these shows, because you're trying to generate so much material in such a short period of time. So you were basically in a little cave with the other members of the staff, and all you did was think and talk about those stories with those people. You never see your family if you work on a staff. You know the other staff writers better than you know your family. So that kind of, you know, hermetically sealed world, you get stuff from the outside, especially from people who appreciate what you're doing, and it's just like manna from heaven.
If a screenwriter's making that switch from writing for film to then television, does that mean they're going to be putting in less hours or more?
They will be putting in the greatest hours of their life. There is no more challenging job than writing for television on staff. Now, the fact is that creative writing is the loneliest job in the world, no matter what medium you are working in. It's just that the pace of television writing is 100 times what it is in any other medium, whether it's writing novels, film, whatever it might be. And so the downside of that is that the requirement that you generate good product in a short period of time is intense. The pressure on these people is intense. But there's some positives. One is you don't have writer's block, right? Because with those kind of deadlines, writer's block disappears. And you find all of a sudden when you have everything you do has an intense deadline, that luxury of writer's block just disappears. You're going to have to write something. The other great advantage is that you are writing on staff. And writing staffs are a very interesting animal, especially for the psychology of the writer. Because even though writing is extremely lonely and the sense of self-criticism is intense for all writers, when you work with the staff, it's all about cracking stories, because we have to come up with a new story every week, and we have to have that story worked out beat for beat, literally figure out every scene, every story event before it goes to script. And the way it's done is, it's done with everybody's in the room together, cracking stories together. And that's why in a writer's room, every wall is filled with the boards, the big boards, and the 3x5 cards that lays out every episode of the season and all of the story events in every episode. And so that requires tremendous brain power all working together. And the great part about it, probably the best part about it, is that you are in effect working in a band. You're playing in a band. And these are some of the best story people working in the world. And when you're in a room with these kind of people at that kind of quality, and it's all working well, it's writer's heaven. Because I equate it, it's like playing with the Rolling Stones. That's how good these people are. They're all great at story. They're all great at script. And so you get this cross-pollination of ideas, these spitballing sessions where they break down a story and it appears before your eyes. And it's just phenomenal to go through that process, especially if you love story and you love writing as much as I do.
But with every band, there's Robert Plant is the front man, there's John Bonham in the back. Is there a certain temperament that's more suited for someone to be in a group setting like that? Because I'm sure that then there's a matter of competition or someone taking a back seat, things like that. What's the best temperament for a group setting like that?
There is no preparation for the psychological difficulty of working in that environment. Yes, the fun of creating story with these other story champions is tremendous, but the politics is intense, the competition is intense. Sometimes there's backstabbing that goes on. I think anybody who's worked on staff will tell you that. There is a tremendous, very clear hierarchy that you're dealing with, starting at the top with the showrunner, and how that showrunner runs the staff makes all the difference in the world. But you have to be able to attach your ego to the larger world, to the larger goal of making this show and every episode of the show work. And that means not only being part of the team, and especially when you're starting out, being at the low part of the team, it also means the requirement to be able to write other people's characters. And not every writer can do that. That is probably the most difficult part about it, because you have to absolutely submerge yourself into the show creator's vision. And if you can't do that, then you don't want to be writing for television.
So maybe go in knowing that you're going to play a very, very small part, even if you're just worried about working your way up, but even once you reach a mid-level, that you're still a very small part in a big
Well,
whole.
certainly at the beginning you're a small part. Your part will grow, but your part is really, it's tremendously egalitarian in the sense that whoever comes up with the best story idea wins. So you can have a tremendous impact on any show that you work for as long as you know your story skills. That's why I always tell writers, that's what you're really training for, is become great at story. Because that's what they're dying for. That's what they have to generate so fast. But where you have to really mold your ego is to understand that anything you create, even your own scripts, will be changed dramatically. And oftentimes, a script that you write that has your name on it, when it finally gets to film, it doesn't have a single word of what you wrote. And if you can't handle that, again, you don't want to write for television.
So adaptability, flexibility.
Absolutely.
Okay.
The number one requirement.
Right. And of the television writers that you know, how many hours a day are they spending on actually writing, creating stories?
Essentially 24 hours. They eat, sleep, talk story, and write story all the time. I remember we used to have to show up by 10 a.m. And you're saying, well, that's a late start, except that the earliest we got out of that room was midnight, and typically into 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. And then you go home, you get some sleep, just enough time to wake up and go back in and do it for another 12 hours, 12 to 14 hours. And a lot of times 7 days a week. Again, it depends a lot on the showrunner. Certain showrunners, they want to make it a livable experience. They don't want it to be hell to work on the show. And so they try to be very organized, and they try to give you at least 1 day off a week and so on. But if the show is not that organized, or the showrunner doesn't work that way,
then you're in it, for 24/7. Again, the upside is that that'll be the greatest training in writing that you will ever get. And once you've gone through it, you are completely changed as a writer.
Should someone realistically say, like, look, I'm sort of handing over my personal life, any free time that I'm going to have, for a good year or two, and just know that this will become my existence?
I think it's a very good approach to it, because that is exactly what will happen. And it's important going in that you know that is going to happen. Because, again, the psychological shock is your biggest problem. Because the requirement to produce quality material that fast is something you have, no matter how much training you've done in the past, no matter how many screenplays you've written, whether you've written novels, plays, and so on, it will not prepare you for what you're about to face. And the psychological hit is the thing you've got to be worried about, especially right at the beginning. It's like being a rookie in anything. When you first get there, first break in, the adaptation that you have to do to what's going on in that world is, on the writing level, is intense. But it's also, you have to adjust to the psychology of the fact that you literally have no time for personal life. And especially if you're writing for a network show where you have up to 24 episodes per season, by the time you're done with that season, about 9 months, you are this close to being dead. I remember at the end of the season on Jump Street, the head of the studio came to the showrunner and said, and this was one of Fox's early shows, and it in many ways created Fox. It made Fox happen. And so Jump Street with Johnny Depp was super popular. And so the executive came to the showrunner and said, we need 2 more episodes. Well, we'd already done 22, 23, 24 episodes. And the showrunner said, sorry, the horses are dead. We can't get anything more out of them. They just cannot go any farther. That was the kind of intensity that one season produced on the staff.
John, why don't we see more team writing when it comes to film that we see in television?
I wish we would see it. The only place where we have that in film on a regular basis is in Pixar. And it just so happens, I don't think by coincidence, that the best scripts, day in, day out, year after year, come from Pixar. Best writing of any studio in Hollywood by far, not even close. Why? Because they use the technique that TV is based on, which is team writing instead of individual writing. Now, there's tremendous advantage to having an individual writer because you get the vision, unique voice of that person coming through the story. And you don't want to lose that. However, where you get this tremendous value that you get from team writing that we see in television is in terms of breaking the story. The requirement to get the story right in television is the be-all and the end-all. You do not get to go to script until everybody is satisfied, but of course especially the showrunner is satisfied that story is broken down into the beats and that those beats are sequenced properly. Because the perception that many writers have of screenplays is, I'll fix it in the rewrite. Well, on TV, we've learned that isn't true. That doesn't happen. You don't fix it in the rewrite. If you have structured the story in a certain way with the cards, that's going to be embedded in the script. And then changing it is much more difficult when it's been written as a script than if you change it when it's simply a sequence of story beats. And this is the great thing that you learn when you write on a writing staff. So Pixar understands that. And they have writers working together to And they make sure they're not going to go to animation until that story is great and that script is great. And so why don't other studios do it? It's because the way the economics of the system works. You can do that in animation when you have a company like Pixar that has been set up that way. But the way the normal Hollywood studio works is that each of these films is a freelance situation. Each has its writer, its director, its actors, and so on and so forth. And so they're unable to do this team writing concept. In a way, we have to go back to the golden age of Hollywood in the 30s and 40s when we had the studio system, and then you had a very similar type of situation where you had writers working for the studio. And they would get all the assignments, and you'd have writers who had the kind of experience when they would write one of the great writers like Ben Hecht, who would have written 70 plus films. Whereas now, with the freelance system in film, even the most experienced top writers, maybe they've got 5 films to their name, produced films, maybe 10 if they're really good and they're really at the top. Whereas on TV, when you work on staff, you're generating these things at a tremendous pace, and if the show is successful, over 5+ seasons. So the amount of craft that you have, which you then apply to the next show that you write, just keeps getting higher and higher. And the great thing that you get with staff writing and that you get with television is when you write that TV episode, 4 weeks later, it's airing. And you get to see it. And you get to see, how did it work? Where did it fail? I remember when we would look at the episodes of Jump Street, some of them we would say, that's just a great script, that was a great episode, it was a great show. And some we would say, that's just one of the worst pieces of television we've ever done. But both of those were valuable because we get that feedback immediately. As a screenwriter, you write a script, maybe 3 years later it comes out as a film, probably not very close to the way you wrote it. So what you can learn from that experience as a writer, much less.
John, does a great story have to be angst-ridden and dark to be considered a great piece of art?
Not at all. I think that is one of the great misconceptions, that in order to reach the level of greatness, it has to be very dark or have a very down ending or a fatalistic ending and so on. I think this has never been true. Certainly in popular storytelling, we're much more likely to have the happy ending. But what is much more important is, does the story play out the way it should within its own parameters? Is it telling the story the right way? And if that means a happy ending because of what has happened leading up to that ending, then that's what it should be. If it's a dark ending, but it's justified that in the way that the story was written leading up to it, how the character was created, the weakness that the character had at the beginning, if that leads to a fatal ending, then that's the way that story has to be done. I always tell writers, you can definitely have a popular script with an unhappy ending if the character earned it. If the character earns it, then even though it doesn't end up happy, the character was not successful, it is right for that particular character, and that's much more important for the audience, to have that internal logic work.
Does that still apply to television storytelling?
In television, again, we go back to that fundamental distinction between the standalone show and the serial show. The standalone show is almost always going to have that happy ending. On occasion, we will get a detective story where the criminal gets off and we have this tragic ending, but that happens very rarely, because part of the reason that the audience comes to a standalone show is the solution. They want that sense of accomplishment that they get, and they know they're going to get every week. When you go into a serial, you're much more likely to have not necessarily a negative ending, because in a serial, that's part of the point, is there is no real ending. So, and because you have many more characters in a serial than you have in a standalone show, some of your characters will be on an up and others will be on the down. And there it's much more likely that you will have down endings, for example, at the end of a season, as opposed to in a particular episode. Because when we're talking about a season, we're dealing in major arcs, and one of the things that you do as the showrunner and as the staff writers is right at the very beginning of the season, when you chart it out on the board, which characters are going to end up with an up arc and which are going to end with a down arc. And you want to figure that out and interweave that over the course of the entire season.
Is each standalone episode going to have its own beats within the story?
Let's redo that question.
Okay.
When you are crafting episodes for serial television, are they all the same beat?
Okay.
And the answer is no, they're not. And this is both one of the strengths of the serial and one of the problems for serial. With standalone, the beats are always the same. How you fill those beats are different. So, for example, we always have a murder committed in the opening scene, right? And then we're going to go through the beats of solving that murder by the end of that episode. With serial, one of the major ways that it's different structurally from standalone is that each episode will be much more diverse. You can have episodes within a serial that are radically different than other episodes. And it all comes down to one of the keys structurally for how you write television, whether it's standalone or serial, which is the desire line. What do the heroes of that episode want in that episode? Now, in standalone, that desire line will be very restricted. For example, in detective, it's to solve the crime. In serial, because we have so many more characters, each with their own desire line, when we segment each of these season-long experience into individual episodes, what those characters want at any one time will be radically different. And this is the downside to that is it's unpredictable for the audience. And if you like that standalone experience, this is just too much change and difference, and I don't know, did we win on this or did we lose? What happened here? But for people who love the serial form, they like that diversity. They like the fact that they can't predict what is going to happen in any one episode, because it's totally based on cross-cutting among all of these different characters, each with their own desire line.
How often would you say a screenwriter's first draft is their final draft?
Never. But it brings up, I think, an important point, which is that the tendency for many writers is to think that because writing is rewriting, it's a classic phrase that everybody says, they take the approach that go ahead and write the first draft, make mistakes, feel free to make mistakes, because you can fix it later. This is a very dangerous approach, and one that seems to be a good idea at the time, but is actually the makings of a disaster. And the reason for that is that it means that the writer is not doing their structural work up front. their preparation. In any craft, before you actually execute that art form, you need to do the prep work up front. In story, it is figuring out the structure. This is why I was talking about on a television staff, you don't get to write the first draft of the script until every story beat is figured out in minute detail. And the showrunner signs off on that. That's because they know on television from experience, working under tremendous time pressure, that a lot of times, most of the time, it doesn't get fixed in rewrite. Whatever big structural mistakes you make in the opening draft are then much more difficult to fix. And I use the metaphor of concrete. When you write that first draft of the script, that story hardens into concrete in your mind. And now it's much more difficult to go back into it, break up that concrete, and make the kind of major structural fixes that will give you a better script. That's the kind of work you want to do before you write it as a script. And that's why I put so much emphasis on doing your character work, doing your plot work, especially emphasizing the 22 building blocks, because that gives you this sequence of your story before you write it into a script. And one last point about this, when I do story consulting, I would much prefer that someone not send me the screenplay, that they send me the scene list, the sequence essentially of the 3x5 cards, because I can much more quickly figure out what's wrong with the story when it's simply in the scene list than I can when it's embedded in that concrete in the actual script, and there's all this undergrowth, this brush that is hiding what's really wrong in all this dialogue. I don't need that dialogue. I just need to know the story. Everything comes from making that story work, and that you've got to figure out up front before it goes to script.
John Sandel left us a message on Facebook, and he said, I'd love to hear Mr. Truby on the differences between structuring episodes for network/cable versus webisodes. Is the latter, webisodes, often much shorter, merely a smaller version of the former, or are there any inherent formal differences?
That's a really good question, because it gets to the heart of how these two different story mediums work. One of the biggest mistakes that writers make is they think if they're writing webisodes, which are essentially stories on the internet, that it's simply, you simply take say a TV episode and cut it into parts. So if a TV episode is 44 minutes and your standard webisode is 5 minutes long, you just cut that into 8+ pieces, and you've got 8 episodes of your webisode. This is a very bad idea, because what that means is the writer doesn't understand these are two fundamentally different kinds of story mediums, and that means different use of character, different use of plot, different use of dialogue, different use of genre. Now, we literally saw this happen a few years ago, which is when the creators of 30-something did a show called Quarter Life. And it was, their background was television. They're historically major figures in television. And then they were writing these webisodes. Well, the problem is they still had the TV mind. And so they constructed these webisodes as simply parts of one episode of television. And that meant that they were doing television on the web. Well, the web is a different story medium. You can't just cut up TV and make those the webisodes, because then you're not taking advantage of the unique medium that the internet gives you.
So that's why it's very important when you're thinking about writing webisodes. And by the way, I strongly recommend that people move into this area because you can create work that will be seen, right? And show your talent, and it's a new way of having a calling card and breaking in. But you have to write these things so that you are taking advantage of the internet medium, not the television medium. And so that means fewer characters, right? You're going to have a much less complicated story weave than you will in television. It's still a serial, right? So we will be cross-cutting between different desire lines, but far fewer of them, right? It also means that the story world is much more constricted. Television story world is now immense. It's one of the major developments in television over the last 10 years, the complexity and scope of the story world. Well, with webisodes, it's much smaller. And so in the original creation of the show, you've got to be able to essentially create story with very few characters in a very small space, literally a very small space. That's hard to do. And this is why it dictates another particular choice. This is why the vast majority of webisodes are comedies. Because if you have talent creating comedy, it's one that you can do with very few characters in a small physical space with very few storylines. And you can do it fairly cheaply. So again, the trick is study the medium, figure out what are the strengths of that medium, and then write a story, a unique story that plays up those strengths.
Are there a specific set of television appropriate characters, whereas there are certain characters that would be better left to film?
A much more important distinction is not between film characters versus TV characters. It has to do with the genre that you're working in. There are certain characters that go with these different genres. Now, where we see this most clearly in television is in the sitcom form. Now, sitcom is a sub-form of comedy. There are a number of subgenres of comedy, including romantic comedy, buddy picture, satire, and so on. Well, one of them is the sitcom. And it turns out that in sitcoms, there are different character types that these shows are built on. And these character types are there because they can create comedy, they can create laughs, not just for one joke, not just for one episode, for multiple seasons. And obviously this is tremendously valuable because the entire show is going to be built on how the audience relates to these characters and how these characters relate to each other. And again, in comedy, we're always looking at how they relate comically. How do they set each other up to provide jokes? So, for example, we get in the sitcom, we get the scheming hero, we get the happy dad, we get the dummy character, we get the know-it-all character. These are some of the different character types that these shows are built on. For example, Frasier, classic know-it-all character, right? And when he got his own show, as if that wasn't enough know-it-all, they brought in his brother, who is know-it-all number 2. And there's tremendous comedy that you can generate over multiple seasons with this character type. The dummy character type is in a huge number of sitcoms. And, you know, again, this is comedy that can be generated over and over again. We saw this in Friends. We see this in Big Bang Theory and so on. Although and this is a new version of this character type. It's the intellectual dummy, right? It's the overeducated dummy, the idiot savant. This is very common now. And again, it all has to do with knowing your genre and knowing the characters that are going to make that genre work over multiple seasons.
Let's say it's a detective story. So something totally different. What are some of the character composites that they would have in a story like that?
Well, the detective is a major character type. Each of the genres, by the way, has its own unique hero already created. And one of your jobs as the writer, when you're working in a particular genre, is to know what is the character type who's going to be driving this story. Now, the detective is one of the great character types, and maybe the great character type of the 20th century. The detective story is essentially a 20th century genre, and it's built on the idea of solving puzzles. It is the most mental of all the genres. So, of course, our classic detective is the most intelligent of all genre heroes. And the detective that, to this day, virtually every detective show is built on is Sherlock Holmes. For example, the tagline, the premise line for The Mentalist, literally the way it was sold, is that the show creator said to the executive, what if Sherlock Holmes and Angelina Jolie had a baby? That's what sold it, right? And you have right in that premise line the appeal of that show. That's what any good premise will give you. In one line, the fundamental appeal of the show, which is the smarts of Sherlock Holmes, the beauty of Angelina Jolie, right? We put those together and we have a very attractive character who will drive an entire show over multiple seasons. So again, this is why I always put so much emphasis in my story classes on knowing the beats of your genre, which includes knowing the main character who will drive that genre.
How much of being a professional writer is understanding the importance of craft versus the business of writing?
This is one of the common and most important distinctions that is often made when we're talking about writing professionally. But there is a basic misunderstanding that's going on there that is putting these two things in opposition to each other. And in fact, the way I like to look at it is that understanding the craft of writing, a big part of that is dealing with it in a business-like way. Now, when most writers think about the business of story, whether it be in film or television, they're thinking in terms of writing a story, writing an idea that can sell. Big mistake. Nobody can predict what will sell. Nobody can predict what is commercial. And if you try to do that, you will always fail. And you'll have constant frustration for the rest of your life, certainly the rest of your writing life. Instead, what I try to urge writers to do is to approach their craft in a business-like way, which means, first of all, learn the craft. Learn the craft. Don't think it's all about who I know. No, it's all about, is it on the page? Did you write a great script? But then, treating your craft in a business-like way also has to do with, can I create this script in a particular genre that the entertainment business is going to buy? There are certain genres, not story ideas, that are commercial. There are certain genres that are more commercial than others. There are certain genres, for example, that we get in television, that we get a lot of. For example, doctor dramas, legal dramas, detective stories. So in treating your craft in a business-like way, it means, how do I take the steps that I need to take to have a career as a writer, to be paid as a writer professionally over many years? In fact, in my TV class, the entire TV class is structured according to the steps that the writer has to go through to make a career out of writing for television. And that includes things like, how do you write your spec script? Which show do you choose to write your spec script for? What must be in that spec script? What are the beats of the genre that you're going to have to hit for that spec script to work, and so on? You can see that in all of those things, craft and being businesslike are the same. And the big problem that I always have with writers who have this tremendous desire to write professionally is they think in the old romantic tradition of it's all about getting that inspiration from above and somehow just creating this perfectly written or well-structured, well-written script. And that has nothing to do with how a great script is written, or B, how a great script is sold. So that's why I put so much emphasis in my classes on taking a business-like approach to your craft. If you want to write professionally, and I love this metaphor, I would love to be the starting point guard for the Lakers, right? But I can't walk onto the court and say, hey, Kobe's injured now, so I'd really like to play. Just because you really want to do it doesn't mean you get to do it. Those players have years of training, and they've approached their sport as a craft where they learned all the skills, they practiced them ad infinitum, and now they're ready to perform at the professional level. Storytelling for film and television is at least as competitive as professional sports. So you have to have that same approach in order to succeed.